thank you all for joining us today. Glad to see a full house. I'm John Vaughn, and I coordinate the activity here at the Miami Hamilton Downtown Center. And as part of the Hamilton 225 event, we are pleased to have Mr. George Ironstrack with us, who is the Assistant Director of the Mia Center at Miami University. And if you're saying, what's that? I'm going to let George explain it to you. And his presentation today is on Miami's, the Mia perspective, or the invasion of the by the American people of the Miami homeland. I like the phrase because it's something we never say, and it's something we need to consider. So right now, I'll turn it over to George.
Newe, Chikewengo Nundawiane, Nundawikwe, Nisha. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Tepake. Newe John, Nehe Newe MU Hamilton, Nehe Hamilton Community Foundation, Nehe Hamilton 225. Nila Miamia, Neme Shikewens Waane, Nehe Newe Piaikwe, Wa Hanungi Kakikwe. Nungi Kakikwe, Achimane. Nimeke asene sipionge nehe nikaletione wapashike sipionge. Hello, and it's good to see all of you here today. Thank you to MU Hamilton and to the Hamilton Community Foundation and Hamilton 225 Committee for inviting me here to speak. And it's great to come and speak to a full house. I'll come speak to a quarter full house, but it's a lot more fun to speak to a full house. So, newe. There's a few seats over here for those of you coming in late. And a few seats over here, although you won't have as good of an angle on the slides. As John said, I'm here to talk to you today about our perspective on the construction of Fort Hamilton and the battle on the Wabash that followed in 1791, a battle oftentimes referred to as St. Clair's defeat, but a battle that is better named in our own language, the battle on the Wabash, or the Battle of the Wabash. Before I launch into that talk, though, I always start all of my presentations in our homelands with just a heavy emphasis on who we are today and the work we do today. And the reason I do that is very strategic. It's because in my experience across the Midwest, I was born and grew up in Chicago. My experience across the Midwest as a teacher, a lot of people who grew up here in the Midwest don't have direct contact with tribes today as living, vibrant, sovereign political entities. And that's because we were forcibly removed from this landscape. So if you grow up in Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Kentucky, you don't have a lot of contact with tribes as living entities. If you happen to come from upper Michigan or Wisconsin, you're probably looking at me like I'm crazy because you grew up around lots of tribes. Or if you grew up in a place like Montana, it's second nature. But here it's not, and so I try and start with that. I work today at Miami University on the Oxford campus in an office called the Mia Center, which our goal or our mission is to advance the research needs of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma with a focus on our language, which you heard me speak to you, our culture, and our history. The Mia Center is an initiative of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. The Miami Tribe reached out to Miami University in 2001 to request that this center be built. It was first called the Mia Project, which for those of you that have worked in the university systems, that's kind of a temporary heading. And we transitioned in 2013 to a center, which nothing's forever, but it's viewed as normally permanent in the university structure. So we're happy to have jobs that are viewed as permanent now. And we're supported by both the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma and Miami University. It's a collaborative relationship in terms of funding, space, and support. It's a wonderful place to work. It began in 2001 with just one employee, Daryl Baldwin, who was the director of himself. And now there are 7 employees, so he actually has people to direct, and he actually spends most of his time directing, which he laments sometimes because he's a linguist by training and likes to just work with language. And he does thrive as a director too, but he sometimes says, I wish I was doing some more language every now and again. It was easier when he just directed himself. The Miami Tribe, if you don't know, is originally from this landscape. The Little Miami and the Great Miami Rivers are named after us, although the heart of our homelands is a little bit distant from here. But I want to situate you in terms of Indian country today before I talk about the past. Today, currently in the United States, there are 567 federally recognized tribes. Each one of those tribes has a government-to-government relationship with the federal government of the United States and maintains that relationship through a treaty process. So the United States came to be through treaties. Most of those treaties were with Indian nations. And so as the title to the land was transferred, tribes retained the rights of self-governance, as well as, depending on the tribe, a multitude of other rights. Our rights are highly varied, although there is a lot of overlap. Today, there's over 56 million acres of land under the control of these tribal governments. These lands sit outside the governance of the states in which they reside. Some reservations actually encompass more than one state. And so the U.S. government sometimes refers to tribes with the language of treatment as state. So our tribal governments and our populations, while small in comparison to the state like Ohio, we have many of the same rights nationally as a state does. And on our own lands, today our sovereign land base is in Oklahoma. On our own lands, our laws have suzerainty over state laws. Our laws do not trump federal law, but on our lands we do trump state law. This is the mechanism by which tribes can open casinos, as well as enforce our own laws on our own land, have our own court systems, especially running our own child welfare programs. So tribal sovereignty is not the focus of my talk today, but I want to make sure you're aware of its existence. You can see most of those lands are in the West. So a lot of folks, if they're familiar with reservations, they're familiar, a lot of people say they've gone on vacation in the West and they've been through Dinétah or the Navajo reservation. That's a really big reservation. It's not really comparable to our experience. So among those 567 tribes, there's a huge amount of variation. So the smaller tribes in Oklahoma aren't, except in superficial ways, very similar to the Navajo, to the Diné. This is Oklahoma today. There are 38 federally recognized tribes in the state of Oklahoma. That's because Oklahoma was Indian territory before it became a state. And it was the final dumping grounds for most of the tribes removed from this part of the country. So if you think about all the tribes that lived in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, most of them ended up in most of them ended up in Oklahoma, and actually in the northeast corner of Oklahoma. So this is where we are today. And you'll see here a lot of names that should be familiar to you if you know tribal history in Ohio. The Eastern Shawnee and the Seneca Cayuga were the mixed Shawnee and Seneca band living just south of Lake Erie in the Sandusky River Valley. And when they first removed as one group, and they eventually separated into separate political entities, very different languages and histories, but they were combined for a while politically. The Wyandotte, of course, this is the last group removed from the state of Ohio. Wyandotte County outlines their reservation here in the state. And then here we are in this little parcel here that's an elbow-shaped reservation. Originally, when we moved into Oklahoma, we were put into a shared reservation with our relatives, the Peoria tribe. We speak the same language and have a lot of cultural similarities. We maintained separate governments, but we shared a reservation together. And then that reservation was allotted in 1892 and very quickly became lost through land sales. And so through a long process of rebuilding that began in the 1930s for our tribe, we began to economically revitalize and began to purchase back parts of our old reservation. So today our nation owns, as a collective entity, I and all the other citizens of the nation control about 2,000 acres of our old reservation, which originally we controlled 17,000 acres of. When you think about that in comparison, our last reservation in Indiana was 500,000 acres. So while 2,000 acres sounds like a lot of land today, it's not in terms of the grand scheme of our history. Many of these tribal names are involved in the story I'm going to launch into, talking about the Mishamalsa Wars, our wars with the Americans, what's oftentimes called the War for the Old Northwest Territory, or the Northwest Indian Wars. From our perspective, we call them the Mishamalsa Wars, the wars with the Americans. And many of these groups were our allies in that exact war. Many of the citizens of these nations, their ancestors, were at the Treaty of Greenville with our ancestors, negotiating the peace treaty that brought that conflict to an end. So our lives are very much intertwined and connected to this history. That said, we don't live our lives today in the past or constantly focused on the past. So we interact, we share resources, we work together, but we're not sitting around talking about, remember when great-grandpa was at the Treaty of Greenville? That's not how we live our lives. But there are members of our community like myself that are tasked with learning that history and retelling it for our community at peak moments where we want to revisit it. Just like Hamilton's 225 moment, we have our own peak moments where we want to sit back and reflect on our history and our historical experiences, where we really don't live our lives in those past moments. So now to the meat of the presentation today, Nimihkas Asenisipionge, the fort on the Great Miami River, or in our language, the Rocky River. So we were not a very egocentric people. We didn't name the landscape after ourselves. Other people did that. So Shawnee and Seneca, other people living on the Ohio River Valley, they named the rivers the Miami rivers because they used them to get to us. Just like country roads around here that are named for the towns on either end, the rivers were named that way too. So we called the Maumee River the Tawawasipiwe, the Ottawa River, because we used it to get to the Ottawa. And other tribes called it the Miami River because they used it to get to us. So very similar to country roads, right? It's not all that different. But that's how those names became dispersed across this landscape then, counties, townships, etc. And if you go to Kansas, it's the same thing. Roads, counties, townships in Kansas are named Miami. And if you go to Oklahoma, of course, the town we're centered in is Miami, Oklahoma, with the southern pronunciation, or northern pronunciation, Miami, Oklahoma. So our name is throughout this landscape, but it's not necessarily of our own doing. So I'm going to talk today about perspective. I have an MA in history, so I'm trained in the craft, and in some cases, sometimes I'm able to be a little bit artistic with it, the art of history. And so we're trained in a lot of different techniques as you're professionalized into the discipline. And as you work within something that's well researched and studied, like the Wars for the Old Northwest, there really is a foundational set of facts that don't really change. Once you read the primary source documents and a lot of the secondary literature, it's basically the facts are out there. But what's different is there hasn't been a lot of focus on Native perspective of those events. So one of the greatest histories of Wayne's campaign, written by Alan Gaff, is a wonderfully detailed book. But he begins it by saying, I'm not even going to try to engage the Native perspective because there are no Native primary source documents, therefore I'm not going to do it. And that's a huge mistake from my perspective. He could say he lacks the ability to do it. I could accept that. Or the time. I could accept that because it's already a very thick book. But to just say it can't be done is a huge mistake, because hopefully I'll demonstrate to you today that it can be done at least a little bit. So when we think about these moments, like an anniversary like 225 years for the city of Hamilton, and we gather together to commemorate, remember, and in some cases celebrate it, depending on your community. We have to remember that there are different perspectives of those facts. You can document when the fort was built. There's some question about its original shape and its final shape before it was torn down. But there's quite a bit of fact out there about the fort itself. But a lot of times there's not a deep reflective process about what that meant for everybody involved. And so when I drive into Hamilton regularly on all the different sides, depending on where I'm coming from, I pass these signs that say, "Welcome to Hamilton, founded in 1791. And that date means something very, very different to me. When I see that date, I know what it meant. I knew it wasn't a city or a village or a bunch of people moving here to farm. I know in 1791 it was a military enclosure of some kind, built to advance the conquering of my people's homes, built especially to burn out our village at the headwaters of the Maumee, what we call today Kikayonge, what was called then the Miami Towns, or Kikayonge sometimes, where my family is from and where I still have family living today. This fort was the launching pad for that invasion. So every time I see that sign, that's what I remember, that's what I recall. I know that's not what everyone recalls. Everyone probably has their own perspective on it. Today, I'm just going to share what I've learned from my own community and from our own history as we look at signs like that all across our landscape. Today, Kikayonge, our greatest town, is called Fort Wayne, right? And so that name in and of itself isn't innocuous. It's the name for the fort built there. That was the original goal. When Hamar was sent out, his goal was to build a fort at the headwaters of the Maumee River to control and dominate the tribes that lived there. And the name of that place today, the city where my family still lives, carries that accomplishment, right? That's the label it carries to this day. So we have to ask ourselves, founded as what and in what way? And how is that different from different people's perspectives? One group's perspective or one individual's perspective does not make other perspectives illegitimate or wrong, right? They're just different points of view. And what I seek to do in presentations like this is share my community's perspective so that it can be respected and understood. I'm not trying to change other people's perspectives. We just want to understand ourselves better. To continue to try to create the good neighbors that my ancestors tried to create at the first Treaty of Greenville in 1795. That's what peace means to us. To have peace and understanding, to have neighbors who understand each other. Not that we always agree on everything, but that we understand each other. So stepping way back in time, for us, before you can date things, this is our historic landscape, a place that today we call Myaomyonge, the place of the Miamis in our language. Our ancestors did not give it that name. They didn't use nation-state style concepts. This was the place where they lived their lives, where they gathered their economic base from. And when I say economy, I mean economy in the most basic sense. This is how we fed ourselves, clothed ourselves, and housed ourselves. This is how we thrived in the periods of time when we thrived before contact with Europeans, and especially before contact with European diseases. We have a story that recounts our arrival in this landscape, in this river valley here, a river valley we call Sakiweonge, that today is the St. Joseph's River of Michigan, coming off Lake Michigan, and coming down to South Bend, Indiana here, where we built our first village. We have no stories before that. So that's the oldest story we have of our people. Archaeologists say we probably arrived here, according to their evidence, around 1000 of the Common Era. In our community, we're not really concerned with dating that, but I'll give you that information in case you're interested. We feel like that's probably a pretty good guess. We've been there at least that long, and some people say maybe a little bit longer. But we're pretty sure that we were there at that time or maybe a little bit before. What's important to know from our perspective and from the vast stories we have after that is that this landscape was emptied of people. There weren't any people living in it when we settled. We don't know how it became emptied. We don't know what happened, but we fought no other communities to build our villages in the Wabash River Valley. That is different from other people's stories. We know from talking to other tribal communities, they have stories about migrations, and they're very specific when they come to a place and they settle it and they had to fight to gain control of it or had to fight to defend it. That wasn't the case for us. Again, we don't know why this landscape wasn't heavily populated at the time. It certainly was a place that could support people. As we settled, we came down from the Sakiwe-Sipiwe and settled the Wabash River Valley, this central part of the Wabash River Valley, running from about, this is where Lafayette, Indiana is today, and here's Fort Wayne. That was the heaviest concentration zone of our semi-permanent villages. We view them as permanent, I should say, minutene, they're towns to us. Archaeologists, anthropologists call them semi-permanent because they shifted slightly around the confluence of rivers. As the farm fields became depleted of nutritional value in terms of the soil, they would move slightly. From our perspective, culturally, it's still the same village. They just shifted the neighborhood slightly to gain access to different farm fields. So we see this as permanent villages. We did live a seasonal lifestyle where the village population became less during the winter time as people dispersed to winter hunting camps. But the village was never emptied of people. Usually the older people and younger folk who weren't as easily able to travel stayed in those summer villages. Outside of that heartland, there are two major villages that I want to point out. One, Achipikahyonge, the root place, which is Vincennes today, a long history living there. And then here in what is today the state of Ohio, a village oftentimes called Pickawillany, Pingwawaleniongge, near Piqua, Ohio, was an established village and a couple of windows for our people. And it's where, in terms of the British colonial record, it's where our people first start showing up in the documentary record to a high extent. It's the village that I wrote my master's thesis on, so I could give a whole other presentation about that, but I'll resist the urge. And then to situate ourselves for today, the blue dots, this is Cincinnati, and then this is, again, these are approximations. This is approximately the location of Hamilton, Ohio, on the Assenesipe, on the Rocky River. If you've read the accounts of the Great Miami, during the low water seasons, it was very, very rocky and broad, and it was not navigable by canoes very far up from the Ohio. That's why we called it the Rocky River. There's also a story of a rather large stone in the river, in the center of the river, up by Piqua, Ohio. But that story is very fragmentary, so we don't know if that connects to the name as well or not. When you look at the French record, the French usually call it the Rocky River because they're translating from our language. And when you look at the British record, they usually call it the Miami River because that's what the Shawnee and Seneca people were calling it. So the name shifts depending on who you're asking. Again, perspective, right? Neither one's right or wrong. It's just a different perspective of how you name the landscape. All the rivers in Indiana, for example, today carry the names that our ancestors gave to them, either a translation or a bastardization of that name. So Wabash River, Wapashike Sipiwe, the sparkling or reflecting river. The Salamone, if you know the Salamone, Unzalamune, the paint river, named for a plant that grew on that river. The Mississinewa, Nemachisinwe Sipiwe, the river that descends quickly. So all these names in Ohio are related to our ecological history and the landscape. We lived a life here that was relatively stable to the best of our knowledge from our stories until the arrival of European diseases. And it was also a shared landscape. So these are all the various peoples that shared this landscape with us. And they moved around at times, some of them more concretely tied to this landscape and others moving depending on the time period. So this is their positions roughly from the 1790s through the War of 1812. And most of these groups, we have a long, constant history of peace with them. So the cultural practice was we had enemies. We liked to go steal people from other people's villages. But we wanted those enemies to be distant. So we would travel to attack the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw. That's who we would attack. Or the Haudenosaunee people, the Six Nations, or the Five Nations, east of the Scioto River. Or out west, the Lakota and Dakota speaking people. So our enemies were at a distance. And when they retaliated, which they did, they had to come at a distance to retaliate. So warfare was raiding in style, small parties of men, sometimes women, moving over vast parts of the landscape to attack each other. The people that were close, they were family, they were allies. Ewe malakakoke, ewe makeke, they were our allies and relatives. And in many cases, very closely related histories and languages. Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi are a very tight language cluster, and their language is very close to ours. Sauk Fox and Kickapoo, or Meskwaki is how they prefer to be called, and Kickapoo, again, a very close language the three of them share, and it's very similar to ours. Shawnee, a close language, not as close as the other two, but similar. Delaware, who aren't on this particular map, are very distantly related language. I barely can understand Delaware speakers. They're in the same language family, but it's very distant. And then Wyandotte are one of the outliers. They speak an Iroquoian language, but we've called them our uncles or elder brothers for generations untold. They've been allies. And they remain that way in Oklahoma for us today. And then the Peoria and Kaskaskia are the Illinois peoples. Today, the Peoria tribe of Oklahoma, they spoke the same language as us. So many of these peoples are the ones who joined together to fight against the Mishamalsa, the Americans, when the wars for our homelands began. Inside our villages, this is the style of lodge you would have found for most of our history. There's one more type of lodge that looks kind of like an A-frame house that's not in this image. So there's some variation. But the Wikyame and Kinundewe were some of the main lodges we built, covered in grass bulrush mats on the inside, lined bulrush mats and cattail mats on the outside. And then at times covered in elm bark, depending on the season. And the homes were the property of women. Contrary to common myth, you can't express ownership in our language, and the women owned these lodges. Of course, ownership's culturally defined, but they owned them. They controlled all the possessions in the lodge, and the children belonged with the women in the lodge. Men were transitory in the village, so they moved around. If they divorced, they would go back to their mother's lodge or their aunt's lodge. And women were sort of the center of the community. Family life spun off the matriarchs of the families. And it's in the homes of the female leaders that we had sort of our finishing school. When the French first came to visit, this quote comes from Nicolas Perrault, a French fur trader and ambassador. What he observed happening at the homes, he just saw them as the homes of the leaders. He didn't realize they were actually controlled by the female leaders. What he saw was kind of a finishing school, what paralleled the academies in France, where people learned oral history, the languages of the surrounding communities, the protocol of peacemaking and the protocol of making war. And that education centered on the home. We didn't have schools, but the homes kind of served as schools. Outside the village was the space of men. So the village and the farm fields were the space of women. Men helped in the farm fields from time to time, but it was mainly the domain of female labor. Outside the village was the space of men. That space was trade, hunting, and warfare. And men controlled, had responsibility rather, for those aspects of life. That balance, that equity between men and women continued for much of our history until the era of removal when drastic shifts occurred. So that life, as I said, was pretty well established and calm in the Wabash River Valley when the first waves of European disease came through in the 1500s. We're still, right now, learning more about our early history. And so actually I'm more hesitant to tell that part of our story now than I was 5 or 6 years ago, because a lot of what I thought I knew is being disrupted by new archaeological data. But it looks like the initial waves of disease, especially smallpox, which came through in the 1520s, more heavily disrupted our communities than we originally thought. So it may be that, in fact, we were forced to flee earlier than the original time period people calculated, which was in the 1640s. We may have actually left the Wabash River Valley in the 1540s or 1520s. So I'll stop there because I don't know enough anymore to talk about it. But after, we can say that in about 1700, we were able to reestablish ourselves in the Wabash River Valley and begin to rebuild in a period that I call, when I'm talking to our community, the long peace. It's the longest period of relative peace in our people's history. And it's from about 1700 until the 1770s or the early 1780s. So about 70 to 80 years of peace. That's the longest period of cultural, political, and military peace in our people's history. We have not been able to rest since then. And those disruptions that ended that period of peace began as the American Revolution was ending. Right? So I'm not here to talk about American history, but just to remind us of a few things, that a lot of American colonists wanted to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. They were upset that the British were restricting that. And as the war ended, more and more people could pour across that mountain range into the Ohio River Valley, especially Virginians. Our name for the Americans today, Mishamalsa, the Big Knives, was originally our name for just the Virginians. And we had other names for the other American colonists. That shifted as the Virginians came to define the American experience for us. Virginian attitudes and Kentuckian attitudes came to define, and behaviors came to define who we saw the Americans as. And so eventually we called all Americans Mishimalsa or Mishimalsake, the Big Knives. So some of the earliest invasions actually occurred in the southern Wabash River Valley and southern Mississippi Valley, or central Mississippi Valley, the American Bottom, with George Rogers Clark's invasion in 1778 and 1779. His goal was to capture Detroit, but he was unable to maintain his supply lines. He faced near mutinous circumstances, and he didn't get as much support from the former French inhabitants of the Cahokia region around St. Louis today. And so he only made it as far as Vincennes, but still had a major impact, captured the British governor, lieutenant governor rather, and defeated a mildly large force of native allies. And most importantly, his invasion actually divided our people. This is something that was forgotten in my own community. But if you look closely at the record, the Wea and Piankashaw people living in the southern Wabash, who at this time were a part of the Miami Nation writ large, they supported George Rogers Clark. Now, he had to twist their arm a little bit, but in the end, they weren't quite sure who they disliked more, the British or the Americans, and they sided with George Rogers Clark to attack the British. But Miami people from Fort Wayne sided with Hamilton coming down from Detroit with the British. And so you actually had, they didn't take up arms against each other, but they were still on opposite sides of this conflict. What's playing out here is that actually Miami people weren't 100% against the Americans from the get-go. And some key Miami leaders, like Pecana, who I descend from his sister, or he's oftentimes called Pecan, he actually was toying with siding with the Americans. And it wasn't until a large number of his family were attacked unprovoked at their campsite and killed by Kentucky volunteers that he finally turned and decided to fight against the Americans. But he was half going to side with the Americans. And it was only the failure to control, especially Kentucky frontiersmen, who were volunteering to attack Indians who couldn't differentiate between tribes, didn't care to, that we were pushed solidly into the American camp. Le Balme's raid, which Le Balme was a French cavalry officer who kind of took it upon himself to complete what George Rogers Clark couldn't. He thought that because he was French-speaking, he could really rally together the French-speaking peoples in the lower Wabash and in the central Mississippi Valley, and he could lead them all the way to Detroit and capture Detroit. He made it as far as Kikayonge, and they got distracted there raiding all of the fur trading houses that had been abandoned. They spent, I think, 12 days in Fort Wayne, what became Fort Wayne, raiding the trading houses. And so they were still sitting around doing nothing when the large hunting parties that hadn't been there to defend the village returned. They then ran to the west of the village, were surrounded and cut apart. Half of LeBaum's men were killed, half fled, and LeBaum himself was killed. And it's oftentimes called LeBaum's defeat, right? So it's his fault instead of our victory. We certainly did have a victory in that particular case, and he never made it near Detroit. He stalled out in Fort Wayne. But again, that was viewed as an action undertaken by the Americans. So while LeBaum himself was French, he was seen as working on behalf of the Americans. And it convinced Miami people, especially those living in the Fort Wayne area, what became Fort Wayne rather, the Kikayonge area, to resist the Americans. And especially to not come to the treaty table as the Americans continued to push for that. Here's just some of our village names. So Kikayonge is what we call this village today. Originally it was probably called Miamia Minutene, the Miami village, because it was the first of our villages, it was the most prominent. Beginning in the 1780s and 1790s, it started to be called Kikayonge, and that name is stuck today. So in my own community, I use this name when I talk about it. I don't use Fort Wayne, I don't use Miami villages, I call it Kikayonge, because that's what people call it today in our language. Nemachisinwe village is roughly where Peru, Indiana is today. Kenepequamequa is the Eel River village. Ketepequana is the Buffalo Fish village, or the Tippecanoe village. Waiatanonge is the Wia village. This is the Piankashaw village, Paangishionge, their first and primary village. And here's Achipikakyonge, the root place, which is Vincennes. So the American Revolution was brought to an end by a treaty in Paris, right? 1783. I just checked it again this morning to be sure that the American Indians, Native Americans, even savages, doesn't show up in the treaty in one single article. So the British, who had promised all kinds of things to us over the course of the Revolution, especially to the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, didn't even request anything regarding their Native allies in that treaty. But the British transferred control, invented control that they hadn't gotten from the French at the ending of the French-Indian War of all the land east of the Mississippi. They transferred that control to the Americans. Of course, we knew nothing about this. Right? We didn't sign any treaties agreeing to that, and we never agreed that the French controlled it before the British. So we never agreed to any of this. And the Americans knew that. If you want to read a great accounting of the American sense of instability and worry about their national appearance and their behavior, read Drew Caton's essay on the First Treaty of Greenville. He really demonstrates just how unsure of themselves the Americans were and how they really wanted the tribes to validate their possession of the land. They didn't just want to take it, they wanted the tribes to agree they had the right to take it. And so they called these series of treaties basically to present the tribes with, look, here, the British have given us this land, now it's ours, so basically you've got to do what we tell you. And the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, that's where they introduced the treaty, especially to the Haudenosaunee, and said, look, here's what it is, the British left you high and dry. But many tribes wouldn't come, or only junior members of those tribes came, so they couldn't get actual chiefs who had the right to sign treaties to show up to any of these treaties. So Fort McIntosh, again, they forced people to sign using liquor and threats of violence, but the people who signed weren't legitimate leaders, and so they couldn't agree to cede Ohio. The same with the Treaty of Fort Finney, which occurred in what is today the Cincinnati area, and the Treaty of Fort Hamar, which occurred where Marietta is today. The same pattern kept repeating itself, where they basically got Ojibwe people and Wyandotte people to cede land that belonged to the Miamis. And the Miamis were unaware of this treaty fully until the Second Treaty of Greenville, when they were presented with it by Anthony Wayne. They said, we didn't know anything about this treaty. This doesn't count for anything. It's not worth the paper it's written on, or parchment it's written on. But the Americans continued to send out calls for us to participate, and they viewed our failure to participate as an act of war in and of itself. So they said, if you don't come to negotiate, and the border skirmishing occurring between you and the Virginians who have moved into Kentucky continues, then you are belligerents, and we have the right to attack you. So this is the the quality and the tenor of the negotiation in the 1780s. As I hinted at, there was lots of raids, especially south of the Ohio River. We have stories of this in our own community. And the lands just along the Ohio and south of the Ohio were hunting grounds for lots of the peoples who lived in Indiana and Ohio, what is Indiana and Ohio today. And they relied on that resource. It was a part of our economic foundational base, especially for the Shawnee, who more relied on Kentucky than we did. This part of Ohio was viewed as our hunting grounds, although it was shared. And a lot of the Shawnee would cross into Kentucky to hunt. And so all of a sudden there are people living within our hunting grounds. And culturally, there's a long history of that. And what you do is you make war on the people who have occupied your hunting grounds without asking to. And that's exactly what they did with the Kentuckians. The Kentuckians would retaliate and come back across the Ohio, and so you had this back and forth raiding war. And it's a very bloody time period, but it's a small scale raiding war. So just 30 to 50 men, sometimes 100 men, going south and north of the Ohio to attack each other. What we have to keep in mind is the Kentuckians, from our perspective, had no right to be there. There had been no treaties signed. And so the US government finally, they wanted to secure settlement of especially what is today the state of Ohio. And to do so, they really needed to stop this raiding. And so they began to organize, build more forts, build an army, and explicitly try and destroy the alliance of villages, which by that time are located here. So all the raiding eventually pushed the Shawnee and the Delaware to all live in this same zone here. And that alliance, the villagers who centered on the Maumee River Valley, or from our perspective, the Tawawasipiwe, the Tawawasipiwe Alliance, joined together to resist that push. In 1790, General Josiah Hamar made a major invasion of our homelands, and his goal was to build a fort at Kikayonge, it was today Fort Wayne. He successfully got to the village and surprised people, and so it was sort of an emergency evacuation, but was eventually fought at least to a really strong draw, or some people say a loss, and he was forced to retreat without building a fort. We view that as a victory because his strategic objective was to build a fort there. And he certainly went back home with his tail between his legs in many different senses. Did not feel victorious. And if you read the primary sources from the time, the land investors like Sims were really worried. They saw this as a loss, and that it was going to affect their ability to sell the land they had invested into settlers. This is oftentimes called Hamar's defeat. But when I went back to look in our own language, there was no sources to say how our people called it at the time. What I looked at, though, is naming practices in our community. How would they name events? And they usually name events based on the place where they happened and then what happened there. So pretty simple means of naming it. And so what happened there wasn't Hamar being defeated, but a battle that occurred within the town itself. So today we call it Mikaleteone Kikayonge, the Battle of Kikayonge, the battle of the place that became Fort Wayne. The fighting was actually inside the town itself, as well as in its suburbs. A phrase that I steal from my friend Cam Shriver. To think of these towns not as like uncouth savage villages, but as towns with suburbs and roads and all these things is an important way to talk in English about and respect people's lives in the past. Following Hamar's defeat, you have a second invasion planned, and it's in the planning for this invasion that Fort Hamilton is built, that Nemehke Asenesipionge, the fort or the enclosure on the Great Miami River is built. And again, you have another large battle fought and another victory, this one a much stronger victory for the allied tribes on the Asenesipionge, on the Tawawasipiwe. Previous to that battle, there are numerous other raids again. So the raiding doesn't really stop. And you have Scott's raid and Wilkinson's raid, where they attack villages in the central Wabash River Valley and attempt to draw support away from the villages at the headwaters of the Maumee. So there's a lot of smaller campaigns, even beyond Scott and Wilkinson's. That's just two of the major raids. And they would go and they would capture families, and they would take the families back to Cincinnati and hold them as hostage for people to come in and negotiate. And they would demand that hostages be maintained until the conflict was brought to a conclusion. So it was a pretty, again, that intense small-scale violence continued throughout while you had these preparations for major invasions. And our people, you can think about our lives being consistently disrupted. The end of Hamar's invasion, the Battle of Kikayonge, left us with very little food for the winter. So Hamar burned 20,000 bushels of corn and squash heading into, that was a fall attack, so it was heading into winter. 20,000 bushels of the food people relied on for the winter was lost. So while we won that battle, we had to go to our relatives in the north and west and basically live in their villages to survive. So people were left in near starvation that winter. So what did victory mean, right? Classic example of a Pyrrhic victory. And in many cases, the victory on the Wabash, and the Wapashikisipiwe against St. Clair, left us in a similar position. While we had defeated this army, and this time to a much larger extent, this was a cataclysmic defeat, destroying the only standing army the U.S. had. Casualty rates unseen until the modern period, still considered by many the most serious defeat of the U.S. Army on our own soil. We still were not in great shape because we had the legacy of the previous year's destruction, a bad harvest and floods the next year. So our food supplies continued to dwindle, and we were left begging for corn from the British. And the British were trying to deliver as much corn as they could to sustain the alliance here. They said, depending on which source you look at, to just keep things at peace or to help us fight against the Americans, depending on the source you're looking at. But the British didn't have enough food to give us, to help us even. So again, you have years of starvation even through this pinnacle victory over St. Clair. I'm not a military historian, and I'm not going to retell the battle of the Wapashikisipiwe, but I want to point out something in terms of cultural history that sometimes goes missing. So the tribes that worked here, they all had their own means of organizing militarily. And after this battle, or actually after the Treaty of Greenville, one Miamia leader, Mishikanakwa, Little Turtle, gets given most of the credit for this victory, which is, in my view, erroneous. The biographer of Blue Jacket, the Shawnee leader, Sugden, says the same thing, although he tries to claim then that really Blue Jacket was the brilliant general. There was no brilliant general. It was a bunch of people working together in a really organic way to achieve victory. And when you look at the organization of the tribes that were fighting together, you can really clearly see this. So you have the Miami, the Miamia, the Shawnee, and the Delaware here at the center of the lines. We're the ones that have been living together for the longest of this whole group. While our languages aren't always super similar, we had a really cohesive working relationship because we've been fighting together for a while now. On our left, the Americans' right, you had the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi fighting together. They spoke such similar languages they were almost mutually intelligible. So of course they would all fight together. And they're coming from the north. They didn't live right there. So they're kind of outsiders coming down. They're allies, they're friends, but they're not from the place that's pulling together this defense. And they're fighting together. And then on our right, the Americans' left, you have the Wyandot and the Haudenosaunee people fighting together. They speak an Iroquoian-based language, which are not mutually intelligible, but are similar enough that they can work together, and oftentimes they know each other's languages because learning them is pretty easy. And so what you see here is a cultural array whereby people who can work together are working together. And that's how victory was achieved. The reason why a lot of credit's given to Mishikanakwa is because he had the best salesperson in the world after the Treaty of Greenville, his son-in-law, Epikaneta, William Wells, who was his translator. And it's, again, a whole other presentation, but having a translator who grew up with you, was married to your daughter, and was Miamia in his own mind, was a huge boon to our community that no other community had in 1795. So when you think about what happened at the victory on the Wabash, the Battle of the Wabash, that kind of defeat, losing almost 650, almost 700 men killed, depending on whether you look at the moment or dying of wounds later, 200 to 300 wounded, right? 64% casualty rate. Any one of our villages, just one village, couldn't put together 700 men, much less 1,000 men. For even 5 or 6 villages to lose 700 men would have been cataclysmic. That would have been the end of the village. That village would have had to divide up and send families to related villages, and that village would cease to exist. So the idea that a community could sustain that kind of damage and come back at you the next year or even in 3 years was mind-boggling to many people at the time. It's just not possible, right? They hadn't been to the East Coast. They didn't know how big these populations were supporting the American armies. The only few people that had an awareness were people like William Wells, Epikaneta, who had been south into Kentucky after some of after the defeat of St. Clair, and he was then aware of how big these populations were. But for the most part, people were unaware. It just didn't seem possible that the Americans could come back so quickly, and yet they did. And this time, of course, again, I'm not going to recount the whole history, but you have a very different, a different tactic employed, strategy and tactic by Anthony Wayne with the American Legion, the Legion of the United States, where you're building a very clear chain of forts. So you're not relying on moving through the landscape, hacking your own road slowly, and camping in the middle of nowhere at night. When you do that, you build temporary fortifications, and you spend hours doing it so that your position can't be surprised. And so, Nemehke Senesipionge, the fort at Hamilton, becomes linked to a chain of forts. So when we think about this advance, from a Miamia perspective, what you have is like a train line. The Americans don't control anything beyond that train line. It's just this thin line of advance. And all they need to do is build a sustained large fort here, and they can control our homelands. They can control our largest villages. And so people are desperate to try and stop this once it begins, but they can't without cannon. And we know that. We've been fighting with European-style warfare for generations. We knew we needed cannon. We knew where we could get the cannon. We knew who had the cannon. But the British were unwilling to supply that cannon. And so this advance cannot be stopped. You see one serious attempt at the Battle of Fort Recovery that fails. And really the Battle of Fort Recovery is the end of serious fighting for the Mishamalsa Wars. The Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi allies who lived distant, they left after that loss at Fort Recovery. And by the time you get the battle on the Tuawa Sipiwe, which is what we would call the Battle of Fallen Timbers, it's almost anticlimactic. Battle lasts an hour, casualties are far smaller. People died, but not on the scale of the battle in the Wabash. It was basically an end game. And the British closed their fort to us as we retreated, and it basically cemented, especially in Michikanakwa and Little Turtle's mind, that the British were not a true ally. They were not going to support us. And it was best to seek peace with the Americans. Again, you see that line of forts after Fort Recovery, Fort Adams, Fort Defiance. You've got enclosed supply points built along the way until the final battle. And Wayne is very strategic and slow and methodical in his advance. So this brought a huge series of changes for our community very, very rapidly. So in the 50 years that followed the peace treaty that brought those wars to an end, we see massive levels of change. This is Pakana here, who comes from I descend from his family group, who was toying with allying with the Americans back in the 1770s and 1780s. He actually became so frustrated near the end of this period, he wasn't at the first Treaty of Greenville. He went to Spanish country to see if he could build an alliance with the Spanish, which failed, and even eventually came back. But he lived a pretty long and healthy life. Up until the end of his life, he was traveling pretty regularly to represent his community after the War of 1812 at peace negotiations. And he apparently died of natural causes, pretty healthy and strong. His lifetime overlaps with Tupia, who was the first elected leader of the Miami people, first leader chosen through democratic election, and he led the nation through our forced removal in 1846. He died at 37 years old, returning from that removal. He was morbidly obese by the time he died, weighing over 350 pounds. He was mentally sharp, mentally strong, and he was, in his youth, he was very spry. But the change in diet and the sedentary lifestyle, you can see it drastically affecting people in a very short period of time. And this is represented by changes to our economic base. So at the Treaty of Greenville, this is from our perspective, we ceded southwestern Ohio, where Oxford and Hamilton sit today, and a slice of Indiana. This was our hunting grounds primarily. Most tribes agreed it was Miami hunting grounds. Again, we shared it, but it was mostly Miami. And then very quickly in the decades that followed, our bison hunting grounds in Illinois were ceded. We ceded southern Indiana in 1809, northwestern Ohio in the years that followed. In 1818, we ceded central Indiana, and in the 1820s and 1830s, we ceded northern Indiana, until all that remained in that short period of time, in less than 50 years, was 500,000 acres in north central Indiana. This was called the Great Miami Reservation. Today, to orientate you, Indianapolis is about here, and this is Peru, Indiana on the Wabash. This northern boundary is the Wabash. So if you'd imagine if this was allowed to be maintained, there would be a huge Indian reservation in the center of Indiana. But the citizens of the state of Indiana did not want any Indian people to be there, and they constantly pressed their own state government and the federal government to forcibly remove us. And so in 1846, that's exactly what happened. And again, thinking about the landscape differently, troops were called up from Cincinnati, and they came up from Cincinnati, probably following what is today Route 27, coming up to Peru and Fort Wayne, Indiana, to forcibly gather people together to remove them. 323 Miami people were removed. 150 Miamis were exempted and stayed behind, becoming absent citizens of their nation. And then we followed the canal system back to Cincinnati again, where we transferred to a steamship and then moved west on the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, and the Missouri River into Kansas territory. After the Civil War, the same exact thing happened again. The state of Kansas didn't want us there, and we were forced to relocate to Indian Territory. Once again, just like in Indiana, a few people stayed behind. We're actively researching this history today. We know a lot of our people in Kansas. Many of them are citizens of the nation today, but we're not actually sure how many stayed behind in that second forced removal. But I want to make sure that we leave here today understanding the nation today. So that's a horrible period of loss that comes after the end of the wars and the treaty period, and really a disintegration of our nation. Our land base continues to fragment. So from that land base down to a reservation where we controlled 17,000 acres, down to 0 acres, until the 1930s, when the US government officially reversed its opinion and said that Native nations have a right to endure and we should maintain our treaty relationship with them, and we began to rebuild our nation. It's not only that change that allowed us to do it, but for our people, it's one of the most significant changes in terms of allowing us to gain access to resources that we didn't have. We were so impoverished. By the 1970s, we're starting to reacquire land again. First, our own citizens donating it back. So the few families that kept their reserve lands, their allotment lands, they gave them back to the nation in very generous terms. And then as our economy improved, we began to buy lands back. And today we have on our own lands our council house. This is Chimwalkana. This is our council house today. This is a panoramic shot of the crowd gathered to vote for the leaders of our nation at our annual gathering. Our elections occur once a year. And to vote and pass any legislation that's necessary for our nation. It's called our National Council. And when you travel to Miami, if you're on some of the streets, you can find signs that denote you're entering the Miami Nation. Right? And all the tribes have their own signs, so when you're entering and leaving, you know what tribe dwells in that area. And then this is the sign that sits outside our new governmental offices. So it's a large group of properties we own together that have our council house, our police, our courts, our governmental building, and actually one of the casinos we run is on the same property. So there's been a return to vitality through rebuilding, but it's taken a lot of time and a lot of work, and of course a lot of sacrifice on the part of our ancestors. That as a community, we actively do try to remember that regularly when we gather, to say we're able to do this today because of the sacrifices of people who refused to let go of things when they were being told they should let go. A lot of those same people that fought together based out of the Tuawa-Sipiwa, the Maumee River Valley, we gather together today in Miami, Oklahoma to dance. And one of the most meaningful dances we do together as shared communities is a stomp dance. And this is a winter stomp dance, just a purely social dance. And the blurred lines are the circles moving. It's a really rhythmic and beautiful dance. It's hard to capture on film, but this one does a pretty good job. And it's a beautiful dance. It fills the room with the sound of shakers and male voices singing. And when we gather together, you know, as I'm spinning around, I see people and I know their tribal communities. And the historian in me is thinking about the past, right? About our relationships together that stretch back generations. But as I said before, most of the people dancing are just there to dance and celebrate together as friends and extended family. And the last thing I'll finish up with, which is most meaningful on a daily basis for me, is my work here over in Oxford at Miami University with our travel students. So apwe chikke miamiake, miamia mission upon the kaninge. The Miami come back to the big Miami schoolhouse, to the big Miami school or Miami University. And Miami University in 1991 created a scholarship, a heritage fee waiver for Miami tribal youth to attend Miami University. And that has grown over time to today we have 32 undergraduate students. And it's a really powerful process to be a part of, young people coming together from across the nation, because today our tribal nation lives in diaspora all over the place, and coming together to bond around being Miamia, learning Miamia language together, learning history and culture, but most importantly, just being young people together. When I started learning my own language in the 1990s, there was only a few other people my own age. And so I always like to give them, that I walk both ways uphill in the snow speech, saying that you guys are really lucky. I would have killed for this when I was your age. And they just kind of roll their eyes at me, but they do have a lot of fun together. And it's a really powerful community to be a part of. Just to give you 1 second synopsis, in that period of loss, our language actually stopped being spoken in the 1960s. And the director of the Miamia Center, Daryl Baldwin, together with currently our tribal linguist, who wasn't born into our community, but certainly became a part of it over time, Dr. David Costa, they rebuilt the language from documentation and began to teach it again. And so our ability to gather today and speak as a community is in part a result of their work, but also in part a result of community support for that. As the language returned, it was like a spark lighting a fire, and people really are now tending that fire all together. So it's a really powerful thing. And no, these aren't the youngest undergraduates ever. Those are my kids who snuck into the photo. So coming back to where we started, right? That when you think about, or when I think about these signs, Welcome to Hamilton, founded in 1791, that we ask ourselves these questions: founded as what and in what way, right? And for whom? Again, it's not to in any way discredit any other form of commemoration or memory or celebration, but to just take a moment to think about what it meant from other people's perspectives as you celebrate your town's anniversary, which by all means should be commemorated, right? Hopefully the next time you see one of these signs, you'll remember my face and a few of my words. So, Mishinewe for having me here today, and if we have time for questions, I can take some. If not, I can hang around for later.
I think there were a couple of questions, and we have a moment or two
Okay.
to take those.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
You mentioned the size of some of the villages in terms of having streets. What would the population of various villages be?
So that's very difficult to determine from the archaeological record with any exactitude, from my understanding. When you look at the way Europeans typically count population, they're interested in number of warriors. And so you have to run a calculation off of that to try and figure out the size of families. So they try and back calculate. But a typical village apparently had the larger ones, 150, 200 men of arms-bearing age. And so it depends if you multiply that by 4, or our families could be larger, but then some families didn't have as many children. So a good-sized village was between 500 and 1,000. But during the periods of dislocation, you sometimes had villages as large as 20,000 in size. And that's because people had to crowd together into one place. That was unnatural and unhealthy, and disease spread more easily in those circumstances. So I would say 20,000 is way outside the norm. It did happen. But usually about 1,000 was like the biggest village you'd get. And then normal, 300 to 500, I would say, for the smaller villages down the Wabash. But that's a huge guesstimate. Yes, sir.
Taxes.
Oh, of course, yes. So we're all citizens of the United States, just like you all. And I'm a citizen of the state of Ohio, so I pay Ohio taxes and I vote. Yep, so all the rights and responsibilities of a U.S. citizen I carry. I've served on juries too. I think the exception is if you work and earn and live on a reservation, oftentimes then you don't pay state and local taxes because you don't live or work in the state. You live and work within your tribal nation. But very few people can do that today. Even those who work in their tribal nation usually live in a municipality and they pay state and local taxes just like everybody else. And we all always pay federal taxes. There's no way around that. Yes, sir.
I remember reading that some Indian populations faced with forced removal appealed to the Supreme Court and won the case. But they were still removed. How did that happen?
So that was the specific case you're mentioning. Yeah, Andrew Jackson is the Cherokee Nation, which is today the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, successfully won their Supreme Court case, but the Supreme Court didn't have the means to enforce their ruling, which Andrew Jackson said, okay, you made your ruling, now enforce it, is essentially, I'm paraphrasing him. And especially the state of Georgia wasn't going to listen. And so they used their militias to begin it and then begin the forced relocation, and then U.S. federal troops participated. A less known case is the Pokagon Band Potawatomi today in Dowagiac, Michigan. We have a lot of intermarriage between us and the Pokagon Band. They're the closest tribe to our people living in Indiana today. They had a similar situation where they were exempted from removal by the Treaty of Chicago, and local government officials tried to round them up and remove them, and they actually went to Detroit and got I think it was a federal judge, to issue a writ of habeas corpus to release them, and that writ was actually followed. And so they remain in Dowagiac to this day because they exerted themselves in court, and the court said, yep, that's right, you have the treaty right to stay, and so they did. So there are small cases like that scattered throughout the lands east of the Mississippi, albeit they were luckier than the Cherokee. They weren't as large and didn't have as good a land.
Other questions?
Other questions?
We'll break for now, and if there are any other questions, please stop by and see Mr.
Please do.
Ironstrack. Thank you.
Thank you all.